Hi everyone and welcome back to World Literature class. For today's session, we'll be dealing with reading and writing about poetry. So previously we have talked about reading and writing about fiction, and we're just gonna be like having some recap of about the fiction. So when we talk about fictional in terms of prose, this is more of stories, more of in paragraph, and more of long proses wherein it will be dealing with stories, dealing with like novels and all. So I guess we're done with that, and we'll now be moving on to the reading and writing about poetry. So do you have any idea about poetry? Okay. So I hope you have already the idea of that one because I know you've been so much with poetry already way back when you were in senior high school. And I know you have the idea and already also the gist of it. So more or less, our topic for the reading and writing about poetry is more of just a review of what is about poetry. Although we're going to have like additional information about it, but like half of it is more of the review about reading and writing about poetry. And with that, we're just gonna be trying to relate it with with your course and program, which is about the Bachelor of Science in Social Work. So we'll be moving on now, everyone. So again, our topic for today is all about reading and writing about poetry. So let's move on. So for the overview of the topic that we're going to be dealing with is about the introduction about poetry, and review about the definition, the nature of poetry, and then we'll be moving on also with the poetry tools, the words of poetry, the structure of poetry, the tips when reading and writing a poetry, the types of poem, and of course the example of the poetry itself. So as we move on with our topic for today, we'll be dealing with the objectives of ours into this course, which is about demonstrating knowledge in understanding into the world poetry in reading and writing. So let's move on. Now, we'll be dealing with poetry. I know you have already the gist of it and also knew about the nature of poetry, but we're just gonna be like having a recap of it. So when we talk about poetry, this is more of basically the opposite of prose. We're into the prose, you try to read it into sentences, paragraphs, okay, and a story. But in poetry, we try to look it into lines, stanzas, and all. So unlike with prose, you try to read it literally, okay. But here in poetry, you try to read it figuratively, meaning the interpretation is not in a literal way or not in a connotative way. I mean, not into a denotative way, but in a connotative way, wherein there should be a deeper understanding of it, and you need to really read between the lines and try to have a deeper meaning and figurative meaning of what you are reading into the document. So again, when we talk about poetry, this is often perceived as something that is descriptive and beyond understanding. And there are some pieces of information that can help you grasp the poetry, whether you are just starting to learn in terms of analyzing the poetry through what? By different poetic voices. So as you see, when you try to read it, the poetry, different audience or different readers of poems, basically they have different interpretation because they have different roots of how they are going to interpret it because they have different experiences. So in short, and in line with that, you have different relating the messages depending on the experiences that you had. So let's move on. So when we talk about poetry, again, this has reflected into the voice of time. So what do you mean by that? Different times where the poetry is presented, basically you have a different way of interpreting it. So that is what you mean by reflecting the voice of time. So if the poem is basically written way back then, like into the 16th century, you really need to look into the biographical perspective of it. Why? The reason you need to really learn about the biographical perspective of it is that you try to learn how did the author put some attack on it depending on the experience of the author itself. Okay, not only by the biographical perspective, of course, we do have the sociocultural perspective. We have also the linguistic perspective. So, sociocultural perspective is basically more of the societal issue way back then, and that triggered the poet or the writer to really write on it. Okay, so again, you really need to look into the biographical, sociocultural, and also the linguistic perspective so that you will know what is the voice of time of the writer. Okay, so let's now move on to the next topic of the poetry or the reading and writing about poetry. The next one is about the tools of poetry. So what do you mean by tools of poetry? This is our basically more of what is being used by the writer in crafting a poetry. Of course, the first one that the writer, indulge with and use and utilize with are the words into the poem itself. So again, one of the tools of the writer crafting the poem is basically the words trying to put in it. Okay, and another, of course, without of course the idea. Of course, words are just basically more of instrument in crafting the idea itself, to present the idea and also the message to the audience. So again, so you start with the idea, and of course the next one would be the words, and then after that one will be more of the figurative languages and the other tools. So the next tool that you need to look into when you try to write and you try to read the poetry, of course, is about the use of synonymous words. So how are we going to put the synonymous words to make it into really fit to the rhyming and the sounding of the words into the poem? So unlike into the prose or fictional prose, basically the rhyming is not so big deal. But when we talk about poems and all, it's very attractive and something catchy to the reader if the words or the ending words into the poem are rhyming. Okay, but it doesn't mean that all poems are rhyming. There are there are some types of poem that they don't require rhyming sounds, wherein the writers try to use the independent way of writing. Okay, and that's one of the poetic devices. So let's now move on. So by considering this, you need to really learn from the words, from the sound and all. You really need to also consider the diction and tone. So one of also the tools of writing a poem is more of the diction and tone. So what do you mean by the diction and tone? Diction and tone are two terms that are useful when trying to write about poetry. And they are equally important to understand their impact when writing a poetry themselves. So what do you mean by diction and tone? Diction and tone is basically more of the purpose or the purpose of the writer when trying to present the poem. It's more of the purpose of encouraging, informing, inspiring, like that. So if the purpose is set already and it is clear already, therefore the attack or the impact of the writer when trying to put the diction is about, is it in a first point of view, second point of view, or third point of view, and therefore the tone is about the emotion presented and explicitly and implicitly presented into the poem. So the emotion presented and wants to give by the writer or the poet into the poem. So let's now move on. So what do you mean by the words of poetry? Words of poetry is basically more of how the writer or the poet try to play the words to make it attractive, to make it catchy to the audience. Not just basically more of giving the messages, but also looking into how it will be presented figuratively and at the same time the aesthetic or the beauty of the poem itself. So we do have the sound devices, and that's for the alliteration. So when we talk about alliteration, they have the style of the writer wherein they try to use the words beginning with the same letter. So that's a sound device, and that's another characteristic or another style of the author. So the example of that one is the wiggly wobbly wagon wheel. So it is alliteration when you see the first word, second word, third word, and fourth word having the same letter. Okay, so the W letter there, so wiggly, wobbly, wagon, and wheel. The next one is the allusion. Allusion is a figurative language wherein they try to use of referencing to something else outside the subject of the poem. So the example of this one is the open window alludes to the woman's longing for freedom from her current situation. So the reference there is the window itself. Okay. So the next one is diction. Diction, as what I have told you, this is more of the choice of word. Not only with that, but also the way how the writer attacks the poem. So is it in a formal way, the diction of the English language, the diction of the Old English. So again, diction is about the poet's precise choice of words. Okay, so like the word die, the usual word we try to use into the everyday conversation, like that. So the next one is imagery. Imagery is a type or a figurative, it's not a figurative, but a style of the author wherein they try to use descriptive and sensory type of words wherein they create a mental picture. So when we talk about imagery, we try to use, or the writer use different types of images in terms of the sight, sense of hearing, sense of touch, and the five senses. So I know you are very familiar with that one wherein we have for the sense of sight, we do have ah, for the sense of touch, we do have the tactile, for the sense of hearing, and also for the sense of touch and the rest. Okay. So I know we do have other terms for that one, and I know you're very familiar with that one. Okay. So let's now move on to metaphor. So metaphor and personification, they are figurative languages. For the metaphor, this is a type of figurative languages wherein you try to incorporate it with the comparison. Okay, so they are used for comparison, but with two unlike things, but they are not using like or as. See, so in short, they are trying to compare it with direct comparison. Okay. While for the personification, this is more of a figurative languages wherein they try to attribute human qualities or animals into an inanimate object. So for example, the willow whips, the window whisper, or the air whisper, like that. So that's personification. Again, personification, they try to attribute human qualities of animals or humans into inanimate object. Okay? So again, attributing human qualities to animals or inanimate object. So let's now move on. So another one is pentameter. Pentameter is about the rhythm that words in a line of poetry. This is more of counting of syllables or stretching the syllables. So they have the five strong beats wherein like aba, or table. So they have two iambic pentameter. So the one that is probably the most familiar to us is the iambic or the iamb or the iambic pentameter. Some other pentameters are trochaic, dactylic, and anapestic. So as you see, different poems, they have different countings of iambic pentameter. So what is the importance of pentameter? When you try to know what what is the meter or the iambic pentameter, you can already classify what type of poem is that. Okay? So the next one is repetition. Repetition is the recurrence of elements to create unity. So sometimes there is a repetition of idea or repetition of words to create unity of that, okay? And to really create attraction, aesthetic beauty of the poem. Next one is about the rhyming. So rhyming is about same word sounds or same syllable or word sound. So they are trying to often occurring at the end of the lines of a poetry. So there is also the possibility of slant rhyme, or what we have also the words that do not truly rhyme, but they have similar sound or appear to rhyme visually. So for example, the bridge grudge, the orange forage, the said and paid. Okay? Said and paid. Okay, the next one is the rhythm. So when we talk about rhythm, this is a more of the repetition or stress in a stress syllables which create a certain sound and pace. So the next one is about the simile. Simile is the opposite of the metaphor. Metaphor, they have the direct comparison. But when we talk about the simile, this is more of indirect comparison. But they are using like or like as or done. Okay? Next one is symbolism. Symbolism is basically more of trying to use objects, trying to use any inanimate object that we try to suggest another meaning. So a window might symbolize freedom, a bird may symbolize freedom, what else? White symbolizes peace, like that. White symbolizes cleanliness, and like that. So again, symbolism is very important in a poem. Next one is about theme. So theme is also very important in poetry because theme is basically the idea that surrounds the poem itself. So basically this is the unifying idea and also the message that surrounds in a poem. So without the theme and without the message, basically the word or the poem itself is nothing because there is no surrounding element or surrounding theme inside the poem itself. So let's now move on to poetry. Again, when analyzing poetry, it is very important that you try to go through several drafts and also you try to dissect the poem in order to unlock the hidden meaning that can take a bit of time. So sometimes you try to read it once, twice, thrice, or many times just to look into the meaning of the poem. So that's why it's very important that you try to look into the background of the writer, background also on when the poem was written, so that it's easy for you to analyze the poem. Okay? So let's now move on. So most often, the writing about something that we have read, we try to break things down into sentences through lines and stanzas. The importance of trying to break it down so that it's easy for you to understand it. When you try to break it down to lines and stanzas, you try to incorporate which is related to one another. So when you try to look into the relationship of one another, definitely you understand the meaning of it, and therefore you try to understand the meaning of it as a whole. So let's move on. So when we talk about the structures of poetry, we're dealing with lines and stanzas. So when we talk about lines and stanzas, we do have different types of it. When we talk about couplet, this is a pair of consecutive lines that typically rhyme, though they do not have to. Okay? When we do have, when it's about tercet naman, this is a 3-line stanza or a poem that they have or they often rhyme. And the example of it is haiku, because this is an example of type of poem that is tercet. So this is a 3-line only, a 3-line stanza poem. Okay? Next one is quatrain. This is a 4-line, and this is a usual type of poem that we see in it in terms of structures of poetry. This is a 4-line stanza or a poem, and that has a rhyming scheme, and alternate lines will rhyme. So another one is a stanza. Stanza, of course, when we talk about stanza, that's sometimes there is only a 2-line for a specific stanza. But sometimes the normal one that we say is a 4-line within a stanza. Okay? So lines of poetry that are grouped as a unit and offset from other lines within a space. So let's now move on. Again, when analyzing a poem and executing a close reading of a particular poem and examining the effect of the breaking of line has on or how that line is read. Okay? So what are the tips when reading a poem? So there are series of questions when trying to read and analyze a poem. The first one is you need to, does the meaning of a line shift if the words beginning the line that follows are considered as well? You try to look into the shifting of lines. Second, what are the effects does this have on the audience? So effect in terms of its purpose. Okay? Effect also in terms of the attack of the writer. Next one is, are there any words that are on their poem, on their own line? Meaning, are there any words that are repeated that requires intensifying? And why would the poet have chosen to do that? And what effect does it have on how the lines could be interpreted? So again, you try to look into, the effect of each line, the effect of each word, and try to look into the origin of why the writer tries to put it into the poem. So we do have different types of the poem. Okay. That's why it's very important that you try to look into the structure. Not only the structure of the line or stanza, but also you need to look into the structure of the theme. Not only with the theme, but also you need to look into the structure of how it was presented. Okay? And also the rhyming. So ballad, when we talk about ballad as first type of the poem, it's about, this is a short narrative poem wherein the stanzas of 2 or 4 lines have a possibly refrain. The most frequent deals with folklore or popular legend and suitable for singing. Second one is a blank verse. Blank verse is a poetry that has no set stanzas or line length. Usually this is more of a free verse of line, wherein this is a common form of poetry that's seen in a often in Shakespeare, Milton, Yeats, Auden, Stevens, and Frost. Next one is elegy. Elegy is a type of poem wherein you usually hear this one during presented during death or a particular person. Elegies can also mourn the passing of events or passion. Next one is epic. Epic, this is a narrative poem that usually unfolds a history or a story of mythology or a story of a heroic deeds. Next one is epistle. Epistle is more of a letter or a poem written in the form of a letter. Next one is a haiku. Haiku, this is more of a 3 lines, wherein this one is traditionally presented in a Japanese form of poetry. Haiku consists of 3 lines, and each line has a specific number of syllables. That first line has 5 syllables, the second has 7, and the last has 5. Often, haiku themes are centered in nature, which has some reference or to season, and for instance, in one line of a haiku, reference with cherry blossoms. Okay? So another is ode. Ode is often written in praise of person, an object, and often odes tend to be longer in form and generally serious in nature. And the last one is sonnet. When we talk about sonnet, I know you're very familiar with this one. This is a 14-line poem wherein we do have the Elizabethan, Shakespearean, and Italian. Okay? So when we talk about, both forms are 14 lines for long and much of the time focus on love. And often the first 8 lines of the poem, the first 2 quatrains in an English sonnet, demonstrate the problem to be solved. And then the final 6 lines are more of the couplet in the English sonnet, wherein it resolves already. Sometimes we do have the iambic pentameter, wherein they rhymes with A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. While for the others, for the Italian sonnet, we do have A, C, D, E. While for the Italian, we do have the A, B, A, C, D, E. So sometimes that are said we do have, or the groups of three lines vary. So we do have, or any variation like CD-CD, or CDC, DDC, or CDC, EDC. So finally, we do have also the other second form of English sonnet, as known as well known as Spenserian sonnet, wherein there has the rhymes of ABAB, BCBC, and then CDCD and EEEE. So these follow the same basic pattern as the Shakespearean sonnet, but varies the rhyme. So this is an example of a poem written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The How Do I Love Thee. How Do I Love Thee is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So How Do I Love Thee is an example of a sonnet. So I will be reading the poem by Elizabeth Browning. The How Do I Love Thee. How do I love thee? How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight. For the ends of being an ideal race, I love thee to the level of everydays. Most quietened by sun and candlelight, I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with a passion put to use. In my old griefs and with my childhood fates, I love thee with a love I seem to lose. With my lost saints, I love thee with the bread, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after that. Again, How Do I Love Thee is written by Elizabeth Browning. So I would like to end the discussion about reading and writing about poetry by T.S. Eliot, that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. So once again, everyone, this is a discussion of reading and writing about poetry. So I would like to end my discussion already, and have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.